Right. Welcome to the Royal Meteorological Society East Midlands Centre. I'm Michael Stephen. I'm the chairman of the local committee, and this is our first meeting in a very, very long while. The East Midlands Centre goes back 40 years, and the reason we exist, in the old days, it was to bring the Royal Meteorological Society to its members in the East Midlands. These days, because all our meetings are virtual, we've turned it around and we're bringing the East Midlands to the Society. And so our first speaker is actually one of our very own, Professor Simon Gosling from the University of Nottingham. But before I introduce him properly, I need to put in a few words for our sponsors, the Royal Meteorological Society. First of all, there is a newsletter that you can sign up to for free. It's called Met Matters, and I can't actually see it, there's something covering up the website address on my screen, but you should be able to see it. It's again through the Royal Meteorological Society website. You can sign up for Met Matters and pick up all the gossip on weather and climate. If you are a recently graduated student within the last 7 years, the Society would like to hear from you because they're pulling together a couple of focus groups to talk about our member publication Weather, which is a magazine that members of the Society receive every month. For joining this focus group, you will get an Amazon voucher for an hour of your time. So if you're happy to do that, please contact the Society. The name here is Hannah Mallinson at FRMetS.org. The Society is always open to new members. There are many benefits to membership, including the monthly weather magazine, discounts on conferences, access to support grants, and so on. So again, see the Society website for joining that. And if you join as a new member, you actually get a 50% discount off the subscription for the first year. There are some recommendations on browsers, a bit late in the day for this, but apparently not some browsers are more equal than others, according to Demio. If you're having trouble, try Chrome, but otherwise, I think carry on as you are. The other tip is if you want to make the slides bigger, close the chat and enlarge the screen. Questions for the speaker can be posted in the chat room at any time during the presentation, and I encourage you to do that so that we have a list of questions at the end. And finally, that's the end of the introductory slides. I'd like to introduce Simon. So if I go back to, oh, right, okay. Simon Gosling from the University of Nottingham. He is Professor of Climate Risks and Environmental Modelling at Nottingham University School of Geography. His research has been used to support policy making on climate change, including the 2015 Paris Agreement, the UK's Climate Change Act, and the EU's Net Zero Green Deal. And he's written a lot of papers. This year, he was listed in the top 250 of the Reuters hot list of climate scientists, which is a list of scientists who've had a biggest impact on global climate change debate. And on top of this, of course, he teaches students in the university. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Simon and ask him to present his talk. Thank you very much.
Introduction, Mike, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. What I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking about is this question here, really, or more of a statement, which is why we need more ambitious global greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And this talk, the context for it really is very much formulated ahead of the climate negotiations that are going to be happening later on this year in Glasgow as part of the 26th United Nations Conference of the Parties, which is an opportunity for ambitious or more ambitious global greenhouse gas emissions cuts to deal with the impending climate crisis or the ongoing climate crisis. And I want to structure my talk around 5 main themes, really, which you can all see as reasons for why we need to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions even more ambitiously over the future. The first of these is around the fact that human-induced climate change, or anthropogenic climate change as it's often referred to, is already responsible for extreme events around the world. And we'll look at a couple of examples of this that have been published very recently. Secondly, it's important to note that the damages associated with high greenhouse gas emissions are really significant. And this has long been a justification for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Thirdly, a lot of evidence shows us that global warming could have significant benefits. So the third thing I'll look at in this talk is some examples of research that shows what the actual benefits of significant mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions could be in the future. And then moving on from that, fourthly, one of the points that's particularly important is that both mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions in the future and also adaptation could actually be more beneficial than just adapting to future climate change on its own. And so we'll use that as another example to demonstrate why reducing our emissions ambitiously is really important. And then the final thing that we'll look at is directly relevant to the negotiations taking place in Glasgow later on this year, which is the fact that current climate action isn't really enough to achieve the goals of the landmark Paris Climate Agreement that was made in 2015. And we'll have a look at exactly why that is by looking at what the world would look like if we maintain the current trajectory that we're on in terms of what the current agreement actually is on reducing our emissions. So we'll cover these 5 different topics as we go through. As Mike said, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, do pop them into the chat and we'll revisit those or go through them at the end of the talk. So do put those in the chat as we go along, or we can save them to the end if you like, whatever works best for you really. So the first thing I want to look at really is the evidence that shows extreme events are attributable to human activity. And we're talking about extreme events that we're already seeing now, not the kind of extreme events that we expect to see in the future. We've seen a number of extreme events recently. In fact, over the past weeks, for example, we've also seen what's been happening over in the US and Canada with the really extreme heat wave that they've had over this period. And what early results are showing us is that that kind of extreme event, in particular, the heat wave that we've seen in the US and Canada, is incredibly likely to be due to anthropogenic climate change. It's the kind of event that probably would not have happened if we'd not been emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And one of the examples I want to look at for this is based on a study that I was involved with recently that was published just a couple of months ago. And what we did in this study was we looked for the first time at what evidence there is that recent extremes in river flows will have been caused by human activity. So the question we asked ourselves was, are extremes in high and low river flows, so the kind of flows that you would typically see during a drought or during a flood event, for instance, are those caused by human activity or are they just natural? Would they have occurred without human interventions or human actions or influence on the climate system? And one of the reasons we asked this question is that if we look historically at observed records of river flow, we see quite significant trends or changes over time in extreme river flows. And that's what these 3 maps here are showing us. The top one is showing us how low amounts of river flow have changed. So that's really dry periods of river flows, how average river flows have changed in the middle, and then at the bottom, how really high river flows, like the kind of flows that you would see associated with a flood, have changed over time. If you see a blue area, it's an increasing trend. So for example, it would mean that river flows are increasing. And if you see a red, it basically means that the trend is decreasing. So river flows are getting drier. And what this data shows us is that over recent decades, we've seen significant drying over some parts of the world, like northeastern Brazil, parts of southern Australia, and the Mediterranean in particular. And some areas of the world have seen wetter conditions. So Northern Europe, for instance, has seen quite an increase trend in high river flows and mean river flows over recent decades. So are these trends actually due to human activity, or are they natural? Well, this was the question we set out to answer. And the way we did that was we looked at the observed record, which was the first series of maps that I showed you there. We took observations from hundreds of stations across the world that measure river flows. And then what we did was we actually took a model, or several models in fact, and we used those models to simulate the historical river flows that we've seen around the world. And what we did, if we constructed those models with the way the climate has changed historically due to human influences, and we also included the effects of humans on the water cycle, so things like water management in there. If we do that, we find generally the models can simulate the historical trends pretty well. So that caused us to ask ourselves another question. It was, well, are these trends that we're seeing actually caused by water management, or are they due to something else? Now, we found out fairly quickly that water management was not the cause of these trends that we see. The way we actually looked at that was we went back to the various models that we used, and we ran two different scenarios. We ran one where we had no human water land management. So we took out all the things like dams and reservoirs and water abstraction for domestic or agricultural use, for instance. We took them out and looked to see what actually happened if we did that. And actually what we found when we do that, we still get a fairly similar result in terms of river flows compared to what we see if we just look at the observations, the actual real observed data. Then what we did was we actually put back in all the reservoirs and water abstraction and looked to see what happened then. If we did that, we get the series of maps that you can see on the far right of this page. And what you can immediately see is the maps on the far right and in the middle actually look fairly similar. Okay, remember the top showing low flows, the middle is showing the average river flow, and the bottom one is showing the high extremes of river flow. But the far right and the middle maps are pretty much the same. And what that tells us is, based on the model results, the effects of human water management actually has very little effect on the result. So what that means is that human water management is not the cause for the trends in river flow that we've seen over recent decades. It had to be due to something else. So what this caused us to do was look to see whether it's to do with the actual climate changing. So what we did in this case was we looked again at the observations, which is what you can see on the three maps on the left-hand side, so the left column of the maps here. These are the trends that we've seen historically over recent decades in river flows. And this time we took the various models that we used and tried to reconstruct that observed record again. This time we kept in the human water management, so we kept in all the reservoirs and the water abstractions that we've seen historically. But this time we did something different. We actually assumed that we might have a pre-industrial climate. Okay, so we ran the models with a pre-industrial climate as opposed to the actual climate that we've observed over recent decades. And when you do that, you just can't replicate the observed record of river flows that we've seen across the world. If you look at the maps on the right column compared to the left column, you'll see they're quite different. There's one or two similarities in different world regions that we actually looked at, but overall, there are quite a few differences. So what we did then was we repeated the same experiment, but this time put in the historical climate, so the real climate, not the pre-industrial climate. And when you do that, when you actually put in the observed climate that we've seen historically, then you start to see more of a correlation between what the model tells us and what the actual observations are telling us around the world. And what this tells us essentially is that we can only replicate past trends in river flows if we account for, firstly, the human water land management, but more importantly, if we actually account for the historical climate that we've actually seen. If we had a pre-industrial climate, the situation would have been very different. So what this allows us to do in this paper is demonstrate that we can actually attribute recent changes in extreme river flows to anthropogenic climate change above any natural factors that might be at play. And this result is something that we're seeing across lots of different areas of the climate. It's not just devoted to extremes of river flows. Recent work has also demonstrated that recent heat waves that we've seen around the world can be attributed to human activity as well, and are events that would not have occurred in anywhere near the same severity if we were in a pre-industrial climate. So one example is this shown here, which shows the global temperature from 1900 going up to the present day. And there's two lines on this. The dark red line shows us what has happened with anthropogenic climate change. And then using a similar approach to what we used in the study that I was talking about previously, we can see the orange line, which shows us what global mean temperatures would look like if we didn't have anthropogenic climate change. And what you can see is a very stark difference as you move beyond the 1970s and 1980s towards the past couple of decades. You can see that the global average temperature is actually a degree or two higher with anthropogenic climate change than without. And what this study did was also demonstrate what effects that's actually had on human health. And what the study does is it estimates that around 37% of heat-related deaths that we've seen around the world can actually be attributed to anthropogenic climate change. So these are deaths that may not have happened if global warming was not happening, global warming in terms of anthropogenic global warming. And what this study found is that there's been increases in mortality across every continent as a result of anthropogenic warming. And what this bar graph shows us on the right is it shows us two things. Okay, it's broken up by different countries around the world. It shows what the heat-related deaths would be with no anthropogenic climate change. So if we had a pre-industrial climate, and then what they have been when we actually look at the anthropogenic climate change on top of that. Again, it's the extension of the bars that you can see that are the deaths attributable to anthropogenic climate change. And some of you probably have heard of this kind of study, this study here and the one I presented previously. They're often referred to as attribution studies because these are studies that attribute recent changes in the climate or the impacts of the climate on society to anthropogenic climate change. And there's been a growing body of evidence over the past 10 years or so in particular that is really highlighting very significantly that anthropogenic climate change is having a very clear effect on the climate now and also on society. In many ways, it's changed the discussion, because 10 years ago or more, if somebody was asked whether an extreme event that's happening around the world was due to climate change, often the answer would be, well, we can't actually say. It's very hard to pinpoint one event and say whether it's due to climate change. But the science has moved on over the past 10 years. We've also had more extreme events over the past 10 years. And the state of science now is that we are actually able to say with a very high degree of confidence that a lot of the extreme events we're seeing are being attributed to climate change. And I've just shown two studies really as an example here to help show that point. So that's one reason why we need to focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions ambitiously, is because we're already seeing the effects of climate change. It's not something we necessarily have to wait for the future to see happen. The second reason is because the damages associated with high greenhouse gas emissions in the future could be really significant. Okay, they'd be incredibly high and really dangerous. And I'll look at a few examples of different ways that climate change will affect society in the future. One of these is water scarcity. Now, already across the world, there's over 1 billion people already exposed to water scarcity in the current climate and with the current population. The estimates vary somewhere between 1.2 and 1.6 billion people is the number typically given or estimated across different studies. But if we look towards the future and look to see what actually happens under a non-mitigation scenario, so a scenario where we actually allow greenhouse gas emissions to continue without any significant mitigation, some parts of the world will get wetter and they'll actually have an increase in water availability. You can see that by the blue areas on the map here. These are areas that might actually move out of water scarcity as a result of more water being available and assuming that that water can be stored. But on the other hand, many areas across the world would actually see an increase in water scarcity or would actually move into being in water scarcity. And if you add up the number of people essentially living in parts of the world where we'd see an increase in scarcity, we estimate that just under 4 billion people could actually see an increase in water scarcity by 2050 due to climate change alone. That's not due to population change. We control for that. It's just due to the effects of the climate changing. So from the water scarcity perspective, we know the effects could be seriously damaging. And it's no surprise, perhaps, that regularly every year when the World Economic Forum produce their global risks report, where they rank the risks of numerous different things from climate change to terrorism to financial crises, it's no surprise that water scarcity is often located within the top 10 risks globally, because it can affect millions to billions of people, and the effects can be really serious and actually last many, many months to years. So water scarcity is one of the key areas where without significant greenhouse gas emission reductions, we could see significant threats. Related to that is droughts as well. A recent study that I was involved with that was published earlier on this year looked at the effects of climate change on the total amount of water that we can store on the land surface, something known as terrestrial water storage. And what we found in this study was, if we assume a fairly high rate of greenhouse gas emissions, not the highest rate that's often considered possible, but a fairly high one, we would see that terrestrial water storage, that's total water storage across the land surface, could decline by around across two-thirds of the land surface. That's what's shown by all the yellow and red areas on the map here. And what's concerning is that the southern hemisphere is disproportionately affected. Okay, so much of the reduction that we see in terrestrial water storage by the end of the century would be occurring within the southern hemisphere. And if we look at the global picture, in terms of the number of people actually exposed to severe droughts, we expect it to double from somewhere between 3% of the global population, which is what we see nowadays, to around about 8% by the end of the century. So two main points to bear in mind. Firstly, that extreme droughts would be likely to affect the southern hemisphere more than the northern hemisphere, and then we could essentially see a doubling of the global population is exposed to severe droughts by the end of the century without a significant or ambitious reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And linked to water scarcity is food security, because as we see droughts around the world start to take their effects, it in turn affects the amounts of crops we can grow. Now, some areas might see slight beneficial effects from climate change as the climate creates more suitable conditions for cropping, but many other parts of the world would actually see the negative effect. So if we look at the total global effect of climate change and food security going up until the end of the century, under a scenario of no ambitious greenhouse gas emission reductions, we'd actually start to see a steady decrease in food security at the global level. And this is food security defined in terms of major crops. Okay, we're not looking at meat production here, for instance. Okay, this is just looking at cropping. But if we do that, and we look at the current situation that we've seen up until the 2020s, so going back to the 1970s to the 2020s, you can see the situation has been fairly stable. There have been some ups and downs. This graph is showing us the total number of calories that can be produced by 4 major crops that are grown around the world. And you can see the number of calories has remained fairly constant. But as we move into the future, beyond the 2020s, into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you can see generally this situation declines. Now, there's different coloured bars, and they all show us different assumptions. Okay, they all assume a high greenhouse gas emissions future, but they make different assumptions around how we can manage crops in the future. And one of the most optimistic scenarios that we considered in this work was where we actually expand irrigation in the future. So to deal with more droughts in the future, we could increase the amount of irrigation. So we thought it was reasonable to allow for that assumption. What the yellow bars also show us is an assumption around the positive effects of CO2 on crop growth. So in a world with higher CO2 emissions, it's entirely possible that some crops will actually grow more because there'll be more CO2 for photosynthesis. It's known as the CO2 fertilization effect. So if we assume that as well, we end up with these yellow bars, which generally is the most optimistic out of all the different scenarios that you can see here. But what you can see is beyond the 2060s and 2070s, you essentially dip below the amount of calories that we produce at the moment in the current climate. Okay, so we could kind of survive until the 2070s or 2060s in terms of calories produced from those crops, But after that period, they drop and we dip below the level of food security defined in this way that we see nowadays. But that is the most optimistic of the scenarios in terms of accounting for the management options that can be put in place. The other three are less optimistic. Okay, they don't have a CO2 fertilization effect assumption behind them, or they don't include any irrigation increase either. So we see in this respect here, the effects could be particularly damaging unless something is done about the emissions, global greenhouse gas emissions. Thirdly, there's evidence that shows limiting global warming could have significant benefits. So I'm just going to close my cursor a bit there. There we go. So there's quite a bit of evidence that shows limiting global warming could have really significant benefits. I've talked about some of the examples previously just now about what high emissions could result in the future. But a lot of the work I've been involved with and what a lot of my colleagues do is look to see what the actual benefits could be if we do reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the things that could be particularly beneficial is in terms of the effects of exposure to extreme events. So I spent a bit of the first part of my talk talking about how extreme events have increased in recent decades and how that's been due to anthropogenic climate change. But if we limit global warming in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, the actual exposure to extreme events in the future could be significantly lower than it would be if we weren't to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that's what these series of graphs here are actually showing us. They account for numerous different extremes that we looked at. We looked at effects of climate change on river flooding, on tropical cyclones, on droughts, crop failure, wildfires, and also heat waves, as well as droughts. And what each of these graphs show us is if you look at any individual panel, you can see there's three numbers at the bottom of each panel going from 0 to 3. What this shows us is the amount of global warming relative to pre-industrial times. Okay, now the goal of the UN Paris Agreement is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, okay, with an aspirational goal of 1.5 degrees relative to pre-industrial. So anything right of the number 2 here is essentially our non-compatible Paris Agreement scenarios. And what you can see is in every panel, as you increase the rate of global warming, the exposure, and this is exposure of people exposed to extreme events, increases significantly. Okay, it does vary depending upon what you look at. So if you look at crop failure, the relationship is steeper than it is for, say, river floods. But under all the impacts, there is an increasing trend as the level of warming increases. But if you look at the differences between, say, 3 degrees and 2 degrees, or particularly between 3 and 1.5 degrees, you can see that for something like crop failure, which is at the bottom left panel of all those 9 graphs, or if you look at heat waves, which is at the very bottom right, you can see there's a real significant difference between the exposure of people under 3 degrees compared to, say, 1.5 degrees, for instance. So we could see a real benefit in terms of extreme events if the goals of the Paris Agreement are met compared to if we don't. And a lot of the people that are exposed to these events are actually in South Asia and Southeast Asia, which is what these maps here are just showing for river flooding, crop failure and tropical cyclones and wildfires on the left, and then on the right for droughts and heat waves. And this shows the population annually exposed, okay, and it's done at a very fine scale. So essentially involves colouring each individual grid box with people living in them in a different color. And if you look at parts of Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, in areas of South Asia, you can see a lot of people actually concentrated in these regions. And as you move from 1 degree warming relative to pre-industrial, which is the top row, down towards the bottom, which is 2 degrees, you can see those colors eventually get deeper and deeper, okay, which is further showing the effects that climate change has as the climate warms in those regions. Some other work that we've looked at is in terms of how climate change mitigation could be beneficial for labour. So our ability to work is perhaps one of the areas that will be most directly affected by a warming climate. Okay, there'll be effects on wildfires and heat-related mortality and human health. One of the other direct effects is on labour productivity and our ability to work. We know what this is like if you try doing any kind of heavy labour or heavy lifting of things outside when it's particularly hot or sunny. It's much harder than if you're doing it on a milder day or a cooler day. And some work that was just published last week, or this week actually, in a group that I'm involved with, looked at the effects of climate mitigation on labour at the global scale. Okay, and we looked at two things. We looked at how climate change would affect the number of hours that people could work during the day, and then secondly, their productivity during those hours. And we combined them to look at what the effects of climate change would be on what we term effective labour. So that's the number of hours one could work and their productivity during those hours. And as you move from 1.5 degrees global warming up to 3 degrees warming that you can see on the far right, essentially the reduction in labour increases. Okay, so the productivity and the number of hours that you could work as the climate warms steadily declines. And if we look at the global picture in terms of areas that would be affected, the impacts on labour could actually be over 10 percentage points lower at 1.5 degrees warming compared to 2 degrees. And there's a lot of interest in this aspect of climate change because labour is, of course, directly linked to national economies and regional economies and the global economy as a whole. So there's very clear evidence that limiting warming to, say, 1.5 degrees warming compared to 3 degrees could actually have quite a significant benefit in terms of the effects that climate change would be having on the economy. Now, Europe, which you can see on this graph down at the bottom, Europe's located on the far right of that. Europe is an area where actually overall, generally the effects of climate change on labour are relatively small compared to some of the other world regions. Okay, whilst there is quite a significant warming across parts of the Mediterranean, as Europe as a whole, the level of warming isn't as significant as what we see in other parts of the world. You can see in Africa and Asia, for instance, because the climate does get a lot warmer in those areas, it has quite significant effects on labour supply and labour productivity as the climate starts to warm, and temperatures do get very hot in those areas as a result. But as I've said, the benefits of mitigation could be quite significant for reducing that. That's what the 3 different coloured bars tell us for any world region here. Okay, it tells us that at 1.5 degrees warming in America, for instance, the difference between 1.5 degrees and 3 degrees is fairly significant. Again, we see that across all the world regions that we actually looked at. And I mentioned water a few times previously in terms of what unmitigated climate change effects could be. If we do mitigate climate change, again, we could see less severe effects on groundwater. Okay, something like 97% of total global fresh water is stored in groundwater. Okay, water on the surface above the ground only forms a very small percentage of total freshwater availability. So in terms of future water scarcity, groundwater is actually really important. And what we find is that declines in groundwater recharge could be much less severe if we meet the goals of the Paris Agreement compared to not meeting them. Okay, so, and this is true in many world regions. Inevitably, climate change will still affect the amount of water that's going into groundwater, okay, because we expect some amount of warming anyway, even with significant mitigation. But the effects on reducing groundwater levels could be much lower if we achieve a 1.5 degree world compared to, say, a 3 degree world. And some of the areas where we may see very large differences if we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions include parts of Central America, parts of the Mediterranean and Southeast Australia, and I've circled those areas on the map at the bottom right. And these are areas where historically we've already seen significant effects on water scarcity and water availability. The area highlighted in red across America, for instance, is located around one of the biggest or the biggest groundwater aquifer in the US, okay, the Ogallala Aquifer, which covers several states and covers an area that is responsible for a large proportion of the US's crop production. So these are already in critical areas, okay, and the benefits of mitigation could be quite significant in terms of avoiding some of the effects on groundwater storage and groundwater recharge that we might see in those areas. So I think there's a very clear case in terms of reducing emissions that the evidence shows us, reducing them could have real significant benefits. And on top of that, a lot of work also looks at what the benefits of adaptation could be in the future. So if we actually adapt and change the way that we live to deal with climate change, we know that the effects of climate change could be lessened. So that could be adaptation in terms of building flood defences or looking at natural flood management, for instance. Or it could be in terms of making our buildings cooler or increasing the amount of green spaces that we see in urban areas to reduce the effects of the urban heat island in city centres, for instance. We know if we do that, we could lessen the effects of climate change. But what studies show us is that adaptation combined with mitigation is often stronger than just one of them alone. So whilst we could say, well, surely we could just adapt to climate change in the future, we could do that, but the situation will be even better if we also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this infographic here is one that I worked on and produced with the European Commission Joint Research Centre last year, which summarises a study that looks at the effects of climate change on coastal flooding in the EU and the UK. And what we found was if we have no action on climate change, so that's no mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and no adaptation, typically in any given year, over 2 million people would be exposed to coastal flooding. And the economic losses associated with that would be just below 240 billion euros every year. However, if we actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris Agreement, and we adapt, so we raise flood defences to coastal flooding at an economically viable and appropriate level, then the number of people exposed could be significantly lower. Okay, instead of over 2 million people exposed every year, we'd be looking at 500,000 people exposed every year. And in terms of the economic damages, they could be reduced by over 95%. Okay, so we could be looking at 12 billion euros of damage every year, as opposed to 240 billion euros. So the situation is that with mitigation and adaptation together, the situation could be a lot better. It's also worth looking at what adaptation would mean for river flood damages across Europe. If we look at the European scale, each cluster of bars here represents a different country. It's not particularly helpful because you have to know what the European country codes are. I mean, you can see the UK over on the far right, and you might recognize some of the other countries on there as well from their codes. But the main point to take from this diagram is that it shows us what the annual damages from river flooding would be every year. And this is in millions of euros per year. So if you see 1,000 million euros, we're talking 1 billion euros every year. It shows us what the effects are across those different countries. You can see that France and the UK are two of the countries to be impacted most by future climate change in terms of the effects of river flooding. The red bars show us what happens if we don't adapt. And this assumes we still meet the goal of the Paris Agreement. This is a 2-degree warming scenario. Okay, so in the UK, for instance, we typically see about 3 billion euros of damage every year due to river flooding if we don't adapt. But if we do adapt, we can reduce that by almost half. Okay, we can pull it down to somewhere around 1.7 billion euros. And that's based upon building-based damage reduction measures, which is the green bar there. If we heighten dikes instead, the damages can be reduced even further, okay, down to around about 800 million euros per year. But the point to bear in mind is that adaptation can help reduce the effects of climate change. But the amount of warming that we might see if we don't meet the goals of the Paris Agreement are still pretty significant. And adaptation can be quite cost effective. A number of different studies have looked at the benefits or cost benefits of putting in adaptation in place to deal with the effects of climate change. So I gave the example of strengthening dike systems, for example, on the previous slide. What one study showed is that if you do this across the EU and the UK, for every 2 to 2.9 euros or so, you would save between 2 and 2.9 euros for every euro that you actually invest in that adaptation mechanism of raising dikes. So you could, for example, avoid around about 40 to 68% of economic damages by strengthening dike systems. If we look at something like buildings, for instance, and making buildings more resilient to river flooding, for every euro you spend, you could save around about €5 in terms of the damages that you would be avoiding. Okay, so you'd be avoiding around about 50% of the damages just by adapting the way that buildings are being built. So it is expensive, but essentially it's worth it and it's cost effective. And the benefits are even bigger if you reduce greenhouse gas emissions on top of that. Okay, adaptation alone will have benefits, but you need the mitigation on top of it. And then the fifth reason I want to go over really on why we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions significantly and achieve an ambitious goal at the COP meeting in Glasgow later on this year is because quite simply the current climate action that is in place is just not enough to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we mustn't underplay the importance of the Paris Agreement. It remains a real significant milestone in the battle against climate change and dealing with it. But 197 countries signed the Paris Agreement back in 2015, back at the 21st conference of the parties. If we look at the situation by July this year, all but 6 countries who signed the Paris Agreement have actually ratified it. And what ratification of the Paris Agreement means is that the Paris Agreement has been taken on formally. So, for example, it's formed part of a national law. So there's one thing to sign the Paris Agreement, it was another thing to actually ratify it and bring it into national law. But like I said, the majority of countries have done that. And this map here shows the total number of countries that joined the agreement, which are coloured in blue, and then in yellow, they're the ones that actually signed it, so haven't ratified it yet. So there's been, fairly successful in that respect. We've had lots of people actually ratify the agreement. And what this agreement includes is a call for countries to deliver national climate commitments, and they have to do this every 5 years. Okay, and these national climate commitments are called nationally determined contributions, NDCs. And what they are is essentially fairly brief documents that clarify and state what an individual country's plans are to reduce its emissions, okay, with a goal or with a means to working towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. And what these NDCs will include are things like a target year by which emission reductions want to be achieved, and it'll also include limits, for instance. So at what limit or what CO2 or greenhouse gas emission limit does an individual country set for itself? So some examples, for instance, the EU 28 back in 2020 submitted a joint NDC. Okay, the EU typically operates as in the sense of being one individual country that often group or aggregate all the emissions together for the EU. And back then in 2020, the EU target for emissions was for them to be 40% lower than 1990 levels by 2030. What countries can also do as part of their contribution to the Paris Agreement is also state what their longer term goals are. So for instance, in the UK, our longer term goal is to be carbon neutral by 2050. Okay, we want to essentially achieve a 100% emissions reduction by the year 2050 compared to what they were in 1990. And similarly, the EU 27 has a very similar goal. Okay, the EU wants to reduce its carbon emissions to the point of being net zero, okay, and carbon neutral as well by the middle of the century. But in terms of what's written in the NDCs, the latest target from the EU is for a 40% than 1990 level by 2030. And countries can all submit these NDCs ahead of the climate negotiations. Now, as I said earlier, these commitments have to be reviewed every 5 years. Now, the first 5-year review period since the Paris Agreement would have been last year. Okay, it would have been COP26 in 2020, but this was postponed, okay, due to COVID-19. So that meeting is now happening in Glasgow later on this year, and that's why there's so much interest in this meeting in particular, because it's the first time that we get to review what these national climate commitments actually are. And some countries are putting forward more ambitious targets than what they put forwards for the Paris Agreement 6 years ago. So there's various trackers that exist online that allow you to essentially look and see what these commitments are actually like. 61 countries have so far submitted new targets ahead of the meeting in November later on this year. Some of them have submitted stronger targets, including the UK, for instance. A number of other countries like the USA, the EU have as well, the EU 27, Colombia, Costa Rica, for instance. Several countries have submitted more ambitious targets, which is good news. Some countries, however, have not increased their ambition. Again, you can see those that are coloured in orange on the map here. So that includes Australia, Brazil, Mexico, New Zealand, for instance, and several other countries have not increased their ambitions relative to what was agreed at the Paris Agreement in 2015. So why is it actually important that we do increase our commitments? Why do we need to be more ambitious than the Paris Agreement, which in itself was a landmark agreement? Well, the reason for that is if we look at what current policies are suggesting in terms of the amount of global warming that we would see if we were to follow current policies that exist around the world, we're set for a global warming level of around about 2.9 degrees relative to pre-industrial. Now, remember, the goal of the Paris Agreement is to be well below 2 degrees and to aim for 1.5. So currently, we're set to miss that. And what that creates is something known as an emissions gap. It's essentially that gap between the reduction in emissions we need to achieve if we actually want to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement relative to where we are now. We're essentially on course to emit too much greenhouse gas emissions if we want to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement. If we look at some of the pledges and targets that are coming through in terms of what the current situation is, in terms of what various NDCs are ahead of the meeting in November, if we achieve the ones that are there at the moment, the situation is a bit better than what current policies indicate. Okay, we get to a temperature of around 2.4 degrees. There is a range of uncertainty in there. You'll see at the very bottom of that range, it's 1.9, okay, which is just below the 2 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. But what this tells us is we still need to be even more ambitious. Okay, we need more ambitious pledges to come in and to be met if we actually want to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I think as we move between now and COP26 in November, there'll be a lot of interest in actually seeing how the different pledges come in. And the penultimate slide I need to show you really is this one here, which highlights just what our current commitment is to future greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. It doesn't cover all future greenhouse gas emissions, but it covers the emissions that typically come from coal and also from gas and oil. Excuse me. And what this shows us is it's a bit like a population pyramid. Okay, it shows us the age of different power plants. If we look at the very bottom, or the horizontal black bar towards the bottom of the pyramid that we can see here, this shows us power plants that are just 0 or 2 years old. Then as you move upwards through the pyramid, you start to get to older power plants that have existed for many years, or in some cases decades. So at the very top, you can see power plants that have existed for over 63 years. If we look at the very bottom part of the pyramid, it shows us proposed gas and oil and coal power stations that are being proposed in the future. And what the bars show us in terms of how far left or right they go, it's their operating capacity in terms of gigawatts. So we're already committed because you can see that there's numerous power plants across the world that are less than 10 years old, and there's many that are being planned over the next 10 to 20 years, for instance. Now, if we actually want to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, we basically need to commission absolutely none or very little CO2 emitting infrastructure in the future. But the plans are already there to do that. So what that means is existing infrastructure might need to be retired early, or would actually have to retrofit with carbon capture storage technology. And that would include some of the proposed stations that are being planned in the future. So it's certainly by no means an easy thing to achieve. And if we finish things off by just looking at what the world would need to look like if we actually want to achieve some of those net zero targets that we really need to do to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, then we need to be looking at decarbonisation of energy and moving towards renewable energy and including incentives in there. These are things that are included within the UK's commitment to be net zero by 2050. Changes in the transport sector, for instance, and of course energy efficient improvements as well. One of the things that the government notes is changes in diets can have a contribution as well in terms of meat intake and the effects that can have on emissions as well. And what the graph shows is how primary energy production would need to change. Okay, we'd need to see a significant reduction in gas and oil at the global level, and then an increase in renewables and nuclear, which you can see with the blue line there. And carbon capture and storage is also a really important technology that would need to see increase, which is shown by the orange line. Now, importantly, certainly from the UK perspective, it's felt that net zero emissions is achievable with the known technologies we have, and also as an accepted economic cost. However, what's crucial is that there's well-designed policies well-designed policies and incentives there to actually reduce those emissions. But currently, the UK policy is insufficient, okay, even for the previous target of 80%. So very much like the global picture, there is a need to be more ambitious in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions. So what I've wanted to do there really is just highlight, 5 main reasons for why I think we need more ambitious greenhouse gas emissions in the future. I've given various examples from various work, much of which I've been involved with, and I've tried to keep them, fairly broad actually. A lot of them been at the global level, just to highlight, what the global picture is, because this is of course a global issue that we're looking at. But thanks very much for your time. I haven't been able to see the questions as they come through, so I'll stop speaking now, and I'll allow Mike to come back in. And I know Mike's going to go through any of the questions that any of you might have.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was a very comprehensive talk. We do have a few questions. I'm going to start with one of my own, which I'm afraid won't come up on the screen. With a conventional weather forecast, it's relatively easy to check whether it's right or wrong. But with a climate forecast, we can't afford to wait. How do you test your computer models to ensure confidence in your predictions?
Lines, or it essentially is the foundation of all the climate models that exist in the scientific community that are used to predict climate change. And as with any model, we need to have confidence in it if we're going to use it to inform any kind of decisions, especially global policy decisions on climate change. And the way that climate models are typically tested to see how good they are is they're used to simulate periods of the climate that we know, that we have data for, so that we know what they look like. So climate models will typically be run for a historical period, like the past 3 or 4 decades, for instance. And the climate models will be run for that period, and then we'll look to see how well do they actually perform at simulating that historical climate, and how good are they at simulating the past. What that tells you is what the model's strengths and weaknesses are. Okay, and we know from that the models can be good at predicting certain elements of the climate, but they're less good at simulating others. Okay, so they do struggle with some parts of the climate system. The global average response tends to be quite good, but if you focus down on very small regions, they don't perform so well. And some models perform better than others. And what you generally find is if you take lots of models and you average the results across them, that average result is generally better than any individual model on its own. And that's why quite often in a lot of the studies on future climate change, you'll see that results are presented as an average across multiple models. And in fact, many of the graphs I showed you today were results from the average model rather than any individual model. But that's the way that we test the ability of the models. It's worth noting that we'll never know until we get to the future how good those models are at actually predicting the future, because they're predicting something that hasn't happened. So we have to go off their ability to predict what the historical climate looks like.
Well, thank you very much for that. I've got a couple questions here from, this is from Joe. It says, hi Simon, I believe the current temperature excursion is about 1.1 degrees C and the rate of increase is about 0.2 degrees C per decade. What are your own predictions of the excursion by the end of the century? Yeah, I think yes, the current excursion is about 1.1. Some studies say it's about 1.2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial already. It's actually quite terrifying how quickly the rate of increase is going up.
I sometimes think about this in terms of lectures I've given at the university. I remember when I started lecturing on a global climate change module that I delivered to our third year students in geography. The amount of global warming was it was below 1 degree relative to pre-industrial, and it's creeping up. In terms of what my prediction would be for by the end of the century, it's a really hard question to answer. I'll kind of give you my own kind of personal view on it. Not one that I would give you by running a model myself and estimating what the future warming would be. But I think the way we're heading is I think achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement is proving challenging. And I think when you look at a lot of the results that do come out from different studies, we're looking at going above 2 degrees. And we're probably heading for somewhere around 2.5 degrees, okay, 2.5, 2.6, something like that. A lot of it is going to be determined by what happens later on this year. So optimistically, I'd like to think we'd get to below 2 degrees. But it's why this meeting in Glasgow is so important, because I think we can get to below 2 degrees, but we need really ambitious targets in place. And it might be that what actually happens is we overshoot. So we have our 2 degree target, and I think it's realistic that we'll probably overshoot that and we won't achieve it. But then with time, over the coming decades, we'll pull down our emissions and actually pull that level of temperature back down to 2 degrees and to below it. And we may well get there by 2100. But I think by 2050, we may well exceed it and then pull it back down. So there's a lot of uncertainties in there. But I think overshooting is probably the most likely scenario at the moment.
Well, thank you very much. I've got a question from Mike. He says, given Russia's drive to claim and develop oil and gas deposits in the Arctic, and Venezuela's continued claims, apparently supported by an oil company, on any bit of Guyana under which oil deposits are believed to exist, do you think that national governments will be able to succeed in a worldwide reduction of global emissions to the desired levels?
Well, I think what evidence shows us from several years of climate negotiations prior to the Paris Agreement in 2015 is that it's very difficult to come to a global agreement and achieve the reductions that are needed. It's why the 2015 agreement was so significant. We have seen challenges since 2015 in terms of the US initially pulled out of the Paris Agreement and indicated their intention to do that. They're now, of course, back in. And I think what we'll probably see over the coming years and even the coming decade as we move through is we'll see this year-to-year variability, and in terms of how the global politics around emissions reductions plays out. We'll see examples from around the world as politics changes and situations change. We've had the pandemic, of course, and the effects that has had as well. So I think overall, I think we will start to pull down global emissions to the desired levels, but it's going to take a while in terms of actually doing that effectively. It'll be it's very much a political decision-making process that takes place that we see at the COP meetings every year. So I am optimistic that we will actually get there, but I think we'll see more of the kind of situations that we've seen since the Paris Agreement was signed, with countries seeing things differently from time to time on this.
All right, so I've got one final question here from Roger. How do you answer the climate skeptics? Well, for example, is a heat wave in Western United States going to be enough in that part of the world, or is it going to take many more such events?
Well, to be honest, it depends what somebody's asking. I mean, the questions do vary. I mean, it does depend on what the question is. I think the way I've always answered any questions from anyone who's either skeptical or denialist, or even if they just had a different perception of something on climate change, I just always try and look at what the science is actually telling us. We're fortunate that there's just so much evidence out there now that shows us what the climate is how the climate is changing and how it will change in the future. And there's just a huge wealth of studies that are consistently showing and a consensus around this. So usually it just involves pointing those points out, really. But it does depend on the question, because it can be very specific sometimes in terms of what the question is.
All right. I've got one more of my own, a quick one. You mentioned that EU emissions target was to be 40% lower than 1990 by 2030. Now we're almost at 2030. How well are we doing?
Yeah, I'd have to look at the EU data, to be honest. I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, I can speak a little bit for the UK's targets, independently and separately from the EU ones. I mean, the way the UK has dealt with it is we set ourselves a number of carbon budgets. And what a carbon budget is it basically breaks down the longer term target into more digestible 5-year or so periods. We made progress on the budgets, but more ambition is needed actually at the UK level to meet the targets that are needed. At the EU level, I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the data, to be honest, Mike.
Right. Well, the EU was the example you gave. I mean, that was all. Okay, I think we should probably wrap it up there. I've got one or two winding up things to mention. But first of all, may I thank you very much for your talk. We need the end slides, Eleanor. I think. Oh, there we are. Oh. No, there we aren't.
No, there's some extra ones for me, though.
That's you. Okay.
Mike, I'm very happy to answer the one or two questions on the chat.
Okay. I was looking for the winding up slides, but anyway, they will appear in due course. Right. Some more questions have appeared. Okay. Right. Yes, okay. There's one from Cliff here. Is there danger of going too far?
Yeah, there is. There is that danger with overshooting. I think one of the things about a tipping point is we don't necessarily know where that tipping point is at. This is when someone asked me a very good question at the start about how we evaluate whether the models are any good or not. One of the areas where models tend to give us quite different results can be on tipping points, which is essentially those points of irreversibility that once you cross, it's impossible to come back from, or very hard to come back from anyway. So there is actually a danger that when you overshoot, you end up triggering something, you cross a threshold, and you see that effect. What a lot of studies do show, though, is that that threshold upon which you hit the tipping point would be quite a high level of warming. You'd be looking at 4 or 6 degrees level of warming to cross some tipping points, or even higher sometimes. So I think if the world is aiming for 2 degrees, then I would think it would be unlikely, but it's certainly not impossible. And we don't understand every aspect of the climate system and how a tipping point could be crossed. So there is a risk there. Yes, you're right. But I think it would be low if we were aiming for the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. All right. How do we get the message across to local populations? The example here is given of Jersey.
Yeah, I think this is something I've thought a lot about actually in my research, and I've actually been involved in some projects several years ago actually with Nottingham City Council, where we looked at this issue in terms of how do you engage local populations with this debate, particularly around the topic of this talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's actually quite a complex issue because in some ways people are very tired about hearing of climate change. It's something that has been around for several decades now, and the messaging has always been about reducing emissions, and we know we have to do it, but there's a fact that people get tired of hearing it and can turn off when it comes up. So I think there's a lot of interesting research and work in this area that actually looks about how you can do it effectively. And I've seen some really interesting ways of doing that. Sometimes it's around not even mentioning it's due to climate change itself. So the way that some local authorities deal with this is to not actually talk about climate change, but talk about the benefits of climate change in economic terms, for instance. So we all know that using less electricity will benefit the world by reducing our emissions, but it also benefits your pocket, because if you're not using so much electricity in the home, you're essentially spending less money. You're spending less money on heating the home when you might not need to heat it as much, or turning lights off. You're saving electricity, you're saving money. So looking at it in terms of economics and home economics is actually quite a successful way of doing this. It's been shown. Other ways of doing it, I've seen really nice examples where it's done using art, for example. I've seen some various kind of comedy shows as well that have been done to engage people with climate. So it's kind of doing it in different ways other than just talking about, reducing emissions, because it can feel quite abstract sometimes, I think, especially because it's something that's such a big global level. People sometimes feel like they have very little agency in it, when in fact they do. And I think it's about helping people feel empowered that changes that they do make in their lives can actually go on to affect the climate as a whole, if many people act together on it. So yeah, I think that's probably how I'd answer that question there, I think, Mike.
All right, well, thank you very much. I've got one more question, if we've got time. Are you all right with that?
I'm okay, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, this is from Alan. Where are we? In the past, 1970s, a lot of concern about warming was from farmers in the United States who remember the Dust Bowl. Is agricultural interests, are they likely to be interested in pushing the agenda?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the areas I mentioned earlier, just in terms of water, was the Ogallala Aquifer, which is actually in the central US. So, it includes parts of the US that have suffered from droughts historically. And this area of the Ogallala Aquifer, it covers several states. And the reason it's an important area is it provides a huge amount of crop production for the US. It's sometimes referred to as the breadbasket of the United States, okay, because a huge amount of agricultural production comes from this area. It's got a huge economic value as well. Related to that, it has importance for food security. But a lot of the water that is used to feed those crops comes from groundwater. And the groundwater levels have declined significantly over recent decades. They've declined because the climate's got warmer, and also because of over pumping. So more water has been pumped out of the groundwater than has been allowed to go back into it naturally. A lot of the water doesn't go back into it because it's pumped out, used to irrigate the crops, and then the water evaporates up into the atmosphere. And you end up with this net movement of water out of the groundwater and going up into the atmosphere. So there is huge concern and interest, particularly around that region, because of this. It affects people's livelihoods, it affects food security, and it affects the economy. So yeah, it's a really good point. And that area is just one example of the world where we see this. The Mediterranean is going to be another area as well, where we see quite significant effects. And if you're interested in looking at something else, it's really interesting sometimes to look at the effects of climate change on the wine industry, because it's an area where it affects not just the crops, but the quality of crops as well. Quite often in climate change studies, they focus on the amount of crop, but the quality is also really important too. I mean that for things like maize, wheat, and barley, and soybean. But when you look at some of the cash crops and something like grapes and the wine industry, it becomes particularly important as well. So, yeah, to answer your question, it's seen across many different aspects of agriculture as well.
Well, thank you very much for that. Well, a local vineyard was planted just at the top of our road. So the people there are obviously betting on the climate change. First of all, may I extend the thanks of the East Midlands group for your very interesting talk. It's been, and thank you very much also for kicking off our renewed program. We'd normally give you a round of applause, but you can only hear me, I'm afraid. But I'm sure the others are applauding online as well. All right, I have one or two slides just to wind things up. First of all, you can follow this up via the website, so do feel free to do that. We have one, well, actually we have two further talks in the pipeline. There is a talk on weather photography by Matthew Clark from the Met Office, who was until very recently the photo editor of the magazine Weather, and he does some lovely photographs. So this is for all the photographers and amateur meteorologists out there. So that's on the 16th of November. And Stop Press, I heard this morning from Professor Georgina Enfield, who I've invited to give a talk in the new year on the use of historical archives to extract climate data for the past. So that will be a very different aspect of the same problem. And we hope to have a full program from now on. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. We've had a very good evening. Thank you again, Simon, and good night. I'm going to disappear at this point. Yes, and thank you also to Eleanor for hosting the meeting.